Hello, and welcome to our Year in Review webinar. We're happy to have you here. My name is Kevin C. I'm a VP of Research here at Lux, and I'll be joined today by a number of my colleagues that you can see on the screen, so they'll be joining throughout the webinar. Just a few bookkeeping items. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box. Time permitting, we'll answer as many of them as we can. If we don't get to your question, don't hesitate to follow up via email at questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. As everyone's usually interested, the slide presentation and recording will be sent to all attendees via email in the next 48 hours. And with that out of the way, I will jump in. Today, we're going to be talking about really what happened in 2020 and how can we use that to inform what we do in 2021. And we'll do that in a variety of ways, which I'll explain briefly as we walk through the agenda here. So first, we'll want to motivate the overall exercise of reviewing what happened in the past or in the near past and how that can help inform what we do in the future. And we'll start by looking at the platform that we generate our content on, we have tools on, that our clients interact with us on, dig into that data and see what trends emerge from the usage of the content and the tools there. The second portion, which we'll spend the most time, is where I'm going to bring in my colleagues who are subject matter experts in the various verticals that we focus on here at Lux, both technologies and markets, and get their insight from working with our client base, from watching markets, watching technology evolution, what they saw happen in 2020, and what they think the most important takeaways are. And then finally, we'll wrap up with just briefly thinking about how we can be more systematic about reviewing trends, incorporating it into our planning, and ultimately, hopefully, get better outcomes in the future for our innovation initiatives. So the premise of a year in review, everybody likes highlights, but it really serves a purpose. And that's really to review the past to prepare for the future. And there's a few reasons why you should do this and be really more reflective at the end of the year and thoughtful. Is that we're really under perpetual pressure in the innovation community. We need to make the right bets and then ultimately shepherd them through to creating some kind of value, whether that's a product or a deployment. And you really need insight from trends around you to make your initiatives more successful, and also, frankly, kill them when they're not headed in the right direction or when their force is working against them. And finally, 2020 has, I think, truly been a crazy year. And in this case, that's not an overstatement. So how does these unprecedented events, the pandemic and the fallout from that, how does that impact my focus in 2021? So there's a lot of reasons why this year, more than ever, it's really important to understand what happened and how it informs the future. So I talked about digging into the platform data. One of the first places we can start is what companies garnered the most interest from our client base. So on the material side, the big thing here is a bio-based theme. Genomatica and Tethys, both bio-based materials companies. Neoplastic certainly adjacent to the biomaterial space in that it creates an additive to break down plastics into biogas. So again, this bio-based theme. In digital, as you'd expect with such a horizontal or wide-ranging area, there's really a variety of different focus areas. Everything from 3D printing with Inkbit, which is incorporating computer vision to drive increased quality in 3D printed parts, to Sensalytics, which is predictive analytics, to knowledge management and in Neuron. So all of these three are areas where we also were independently very excited about and also saw that reflected by our client base. On the energy side, the big theme here is CO2. Unquestionably, this theme of how do we mitigate CO2 emissions or how do we use it to be more productive. Opus 12 and dioxide materials, both doing CO2 electrolysis, Svante capturing CO2 from flue gas. So as a theme that will come back and that we'll talk about more today is just the overall sustainability theme, and in particular, this really huge focus on CO2. In the agri-food space, not surprisingly, I think there's interest across the value chain. Everything from shelf life extension with Mori personalized nutrition or personalized AI platform with Suggestic, all the way back to crop protection early in the value chain. So again, impacts and interest in innovations across that agri-food supply chain. And finally, mobility, where we've grown our content and focused on some more players in this space. Interest at the top here in hydrogen-powered aviation, e-bike sharing, robotics is using computer vision for road condition assessment. So really a variety of ways to think about mobility, not just the vehicles themselves, but also the infrastructure around them. So that is some of the data from the companies that provoked the most interest from our client base. We can also look at the larger reports we write and look at how they drove engagement and interest across different sectors. So in the chemicals and materials world, someplace we work really hard to try and understand the materials opportunities for different trends. We actually took our top 20 transformational technologies going into 2020 and actually dug into all the materials opportunities that lied underneath them. Energy and mobility, again, the sustainability theme, whether it's decarbonizing industrial processes or just on the transportation side, EVs plus lightweighting. In manufacturing, we talked about it's alternative manufacturing, which is this big push for personalization and distributed manufacturing, and really explored the technologies that enable that. Agri-food, COVID uncovered some really, I'd say, frightening weaknesses in our food supply chain. And so that made this report particularly timely to uncover how we can preserve the food chain more effectively and what technologies enable that. And finally, on the health side, there's a lot of interest in the data and signals that are readily available to us in digital signals and non-traditional biomarkers to actually uncover and understand better the state of consumer health and wellness. So that drove a lot of interest in our Innovation Digest, which we published in the second half of the year. So again, what did your peers connect with from a sector-specific standpoint? What reports really rose to the top? So that's a walk through some of the data. And again, just a reminder, for this exercise, we really want to effectively understand what happened this year so that we can act most efficiently next year and most successfully next year. So we really need to understand the lessons learned from this particular very unusual year. And with that, we're going to bring in some of my colleagues to be the other part of the puzzle here, to illuminate us on what they learned in their research and what they learned from engaging with our client base. So to start off, I'm going to invite my colleague, Anthony Schiavo, who leads our materials program. Hi, Anthony. And I want to start you off today just at a high level, understanding what trends or technologies you are seeing the most traction for over the course of 2020.
Thanks, Kevin. In 2020, a lot of the technologies that were strong or of interest in 2019, like recycling, like digital sales platforms and materials informatics, continued to have a lot of sustained interest. There was one technology in particular that had a really strong year in 2020 that we actually started out being really negative on, and that's molded pulp packaging. This is where you take a waste sort of feedstock, like agricultural waste, and using high pressure and some advanced machining techniques, you can really form that into a thin-walled alternative to plastics. We had a lot of concerns or a lot of skepticism around this technology because of some of the supporting technologies like coatings and additives weren't quite there. But we've seen a lot of adoption over the course of 2020. We've seen some great improvements in terms of the technologies. And despite some high-profile duds like Zoom packaging, we think it's going to be really well positioned for a strong year in 2021.
Thanks, Anthony. And another topic that I know rose to the top was this idea of recycling.
Mhm.
And my question for you is on the sustainability front, which has been a big theme, is how real is the trend here? Is it a profitable venture at this point? Is it something worth investing in? What is the reality, that, in your opinion, behind recycling?
It's a complex question. Mechanical recycling is something that has a really long track record, but the market itself is really disrupted right now between COVID-19, slightly impacting collection, and sort of the China national sword, these broader bans on waste imports. It's really disrupted the global waste trade. So hopefully that can begin to be settled over the next couple of years. But there's a lot of focus on pyrolysis right now, which really I think requires a strong regulatory framework and a set of incentives. With cheap oil prices, the baseline economics of that process don't necessarily make a ton of sense. So you really need a lot of companies and governments buying in, supporting it financially, and committing to using some of those pyrolysis products, even though they're maybe not as cost effective as pulling oil out of the ground. The one thing I will say though is interest in recycling, interest in sustainability has stayed really strong despite the downturn in a lot of fortunes for chemical companies and other players in the spaces. So that interest, that desire, it's really robust.
And then just to take us home here, based on all that and what you've seen and what we've learned, where do you expect the most momentum in 2021? What are you most excited to see? Where do you want to focus your efforts to help uncover the best opportunities?
So these sustainable technologies, recycling, pulp, they're going to have a big year in 2021, I think, especially as we recover from the coronavirus. But there's also a lot of really exciting work happening with early stage metamaterials, particularly optical metamaterials. These metamaterials have sort of unique properties due to their pattern structures. And so you can use them to create a lot of really kind of novel and in some cases physics defying things. But I'm really interested in lenses. I'm really interested in sort of advanced insulation. Manufacturing challenges are being solved and there's a much better understanding happening on a baseline level.
So I recall in the early days a lot of talk about invisibility cloaks and things like this. Have we moved past kind of the hype part of this where you really think 2021 we're actually going to see some important impacts from metamaterials?
Yeah, I think we have. The invisibility cloak is an example of a broadband metamaterial, one that impacts a lot of different wavelengths. And what we've seen is that companies have been able to simplify and actually bring some initial commercial products to market with sort of single wavelength metamaterials. But we are seeing progress in those broadband metamaterials, especially in lenses. There's some really core academic research that's been happening at Harvard, a few other places. So both in the more focused, ready to commercialize metamaterials and some of the foundational, R&D efforts in metamaterials, I'm expecting a big year.
Great, thank you, Anthony. We will definitely dig into more of your insight around this for the Q&A portion, so appreciate you joining. Next up, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Katrina Westerhoff. She's part of our digital team and leads our Industry 4.0 research and actually also manages a lot of the client interaction across the board on all the topics we get asked about. And Katrina, where I wanted to start with you is, since we formally have covered digital transformation, things have changed quickly. They evolve, new things are developed, technologies move quickly. What is really different from your perspective and what you saw in 2019 versus 2020?
Yeah, so Kevin, I'd say that we continue to get a lot of questions about sort of framed as what does the digital transformation of my industry look like, which is a great question. That's something that's been consistent year to year. But in terms of what's changed, I think one of the things that's been really interesting to watch is that we're seeing some of our clients in lower digital maturity industries that are kind of walking this maturity journey with us. So industries like food and beverage or manufacturing or utilities, and we use digital maturity as a framework for assessing organizations organizational capabilities for digital transformation. And typically companies on the lower end of that framework are targeting kind of these neatly packaged off-the-shelf solutions. So things like, predictive maintenance solution that's really tailored for your industry, or these DIY analytics tools that simplify data visualization for manufacturing. Essentially, they're outsourcing these pieces of their digital projects as they kind of learn the ropes. And what we've been seeing this year is some of these companies in lower maturity industries that are doing a lot more of that digital work in-house. So, a utility company who's building their own predictive maintenance solution from scratch for their distribution assets, or a food and beverage manufacturer who just launched an AI team to develop custom Industry 4.0 applications. So we're starting to get questions from these lower maturity industries on things like, scaling AI or data cleanliness, or even auto ML, some of these topics that we typically would have heard from only from our more mature clients.
So you're alluding to something I think we've looked at for a long time, which is when to build versus buy. So you're talking about people building their own AI solutions, for example. We've always got the question, should I build my own data science team? Can I build my own data science team? So from your perspective, across the board, is there any universal opinion you have on building versus buying? Is it a good idea for some of these corporations to be building capabilities themselves, or is it readily available off the shelf or semi off the shelf from vendors? How would you, what's your recommendation around that?
Yeah, I think in general, towards sort of the long-term view for any company in the physical industries right now, there should be a sort of a longer-term vision towards becoming kind of digitally literate. So I'd say yes, build a data science team, but in terms of individual applications that you might be looking at, I think it comes down to kind of two things. The first is maturity that I was just talking about, and I've had a lot of conversations with companies who are trying to build something themselves, and then a year later the project gets abandoned because they didn't have the right digital foundation in place yet. So they didn't have the right data governance or the right resources or a focus strategy or whatnot. And really developing a digital solution is pretty different from developing a physical product, which is what a lot of the companies in the physical industries are more used to. So, it's a big step. And so if you're just on that early end of getting started with digital, it's often helpful to kind of get your feet wet with some vendors and kind of building some of that competency and that capability as you start to mature towards something where you can build applications yourself.
And given some of what you've observed in 2020, what are the areas that you are expecting to see momentum in 2021, or where you're most excited?
Yeah, so I'd say COVID was kind of a big deal for digital here, because digital is kind of core to this idea of taking an in-person interaction or an in-person task and turning it into something that can be done remotely. And we saw this play out in multiple places. So we can look at what happened in health. And in health, telehealth is of course a big story. We were already seeing traction in telehealth. There's no surprise there that of course COVID accelerated that. Maybe the rollout has been a little bit shoddy, but the real story with what's happening with telehealth has been on the remote monitoring side. So if we look back at one of the landmark acquisitions that happened in this space this year, Teladoc acquired Livongo, which is a remote health monitoring company, and they spent big money on this. This was a massive acquisition in the digital health space at 18.5 billion. And Livongo is doing things like glucose monitoring, activity level tracking, diet tracking that can now be incorporated into Teladoc's telehealth platform, which is interesting and fantastic. But remote monitoring also goes beyond that. It also encompasses things like vital sign monitoring. We've got people that are sharing respiratory data and heart rate data and sleep data with companies like Fitbit to be able to determine the likelihood that they've got a COVID infection. So ultimately what we're seeing here in health has been a greater acceptance of remote monitoring and these big signals to the market that remote monitoring is here to stay. And if we look at the industrial side of this, there's some similar things that are happening, some similar trends. So we saw a spike in client interest around things like remote asset monitoring or augmented reality, worker monitoring, even robotics for removing workers from those processes. And there were some players in the space that pounced on this as a way to increase adoption as well. So we saw like PTC's Vuforia Chalk, which is an AR and remote expert platform for field operations. We saw Machine Metrics, which is an industrial IoT platform, offer free versions of their tools in response to COVID to help boost adoption and get people kind of accustomed to these different ways of working remotely. So like what we saw in the health space, these were things that were happening anyway, but the pandemic has accelerated them. It's sort of broadened the interest. It's created these market signals that this is really going places. So I think we're likely to see remote monitoring in all forms continue to hold this momentum in 2021.
And with remote monitoring, that obviously implies more data traveling between different repositories or different sources. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because data is great, but now you have to worry about protecting it and verifying it and things like that. So what do you think the implications are from that perspective, the double-edged sword of more remote monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say that, in terms of what we can do with this data, one of the big things that I'd be looking towards here is digital biomarkers. And so as we saw people that were opting into sharing this health data with, companies like Fitbit, they're making that data available for things like developing digital biomarkers. And so we're seeing this enormous increase in the data that's available for that purpose. And digital biomarkers are exceptionally powerful. This was on our top technologies for 2021 list that we just recently published. And so this is likely to be an accelerator for digital biomarkers as we look towards the future. And then, it's probably also worth mentioning productivity monitoring. I'm not going to bet on 2021 being the year for substantial productivity monitoring, and this is really easy to get wrong. We just saw that with the Microsoft 365 productivity suite and all of the backlash that came from that. But we have in the industrial space, we have seen some early tools around productivity for industrial environments, and that the level of remote worker monitoring that we've been seeing this year could be a stepping stone towards those tools.
Great. Thanks a lot for joining, Katrina. We will bring you back for the Q&A portion of the webinar. But next in, I'd like to welcome Josh Haslin, who leads our agrifood program. And Josh, a lot of interesting events occurred in the agrifood world, particularly related to COVID and the supply chain and other aspects of personalization. So of all that, what was the most common theme you saw emerge in the agrifood space?
Yeah, Kevin, and happy to be here. And so, yeah, I think you hit the needle on the head. I mean, this was a major year to test our food system, and overall, we saw it really struggle, right? We saw it struggle with identifying where demand needs to go and being able to support a shift in demand. And what does that mean in the end? Well, that means that if there's one theme, that really is important to agri-food, it was food security. And I think we saw, lots of innovation taking center stage as a result of that. And we see nations changing their outlook on what it means to bring food into the country, right? Those who are significantly focused on requirement of importation are now innovating specifically with food security in mind, and we see that happening quite broadly across the world, and it's a major change, and as a result, right, another reason that's happening is there's a shortening of how far food is actually traveling, right? And that's becoming, it's not just necessarily a COVID related issue, but it is definitely related to COVID, and it's also related to changes in consumer demand for those types of things too.
And you mentioned food security, which really is a global mega trend that everybody's interested in. From a technology standpoint, what is most interesting from a technology enabler standpoint? What technologies can really impact food security, and should we look for to make an impact?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's a diverse one. There is in no way, I would say, one necessarily leading technology here. There's lots of choices. You have everything from indoor cultivation and the large vertical ag movement we see. We have things like agrivoltaics, which are considering to link water, energy, food systems all together and try to boost the potential. But if there was one that I would say had the largest impact this year, it really had to do with preserving the food chain. So those technologies that can actually provide a method to extend both the shelf life and quality of food along that food chain. So if you look kind of pre-harvest and post-harvest, what we see are a lot of the coatings up there. You brought up, one of the most read profiles we have is Mori, and here's a company that has developed a coating material that can extend the quality and longevity of food as well as protect it. We also have, the incredible amount of funding that Appeal saw come their way. So, as far as money investment flooding into preservation early in the food system, I think it's been a really key area of importance. And it doesn't just end with, consumer centric, right? Just protecting food has long been a very important issue and will continue to be, but driven by COVID, we've seen a lot of investments into bio-based products as well, biopesticides, and all of these are really aimed at, in many cases, post-harvest strategies and and directly prior to harvest strategies. So a lot about preserving the food. I think additionally, Katrina previously brought up the importance of digital tools, and as you move kind of further along that value chain and you get closer to the consumer, we see the importance of being able to monitor food along that value chain really become critical, right? We want to know where quality is diminishing along that food chain, and so then you have to tie in sensors, and so we see a lot of innovation around logistics and a lot of large companies playing in this space to understand, well, how can we understand the quality and connection of all this and then be able to make changes on the fly in real time. And that's a really big area of innovation that we're seeing. And this also links to the shortening of our food system, right? That length of the chain. If you want to be able to adapt to rapid changes in demand, you need to be able to find places for that food to go. And so linking digital resources to the capabilities therein are really key, and we're seeing that rise in areas like India, where you have a lot of smallholder farmers, obviously bigger, maybe even less cold chain available, and so there's a big opportunity there to connect farmers to demand and do that in a much more efficient way as well.
And building on that, it seems clear that the agri-food ecosystem is becoming more integrated across industry, maybe with non-traditional players, or tying together parts of the value chain that didn't interact as strongly before. How is that evolving, and what kind of advice do you have?
I think there's a really good example, and that is the surge in the alternative protein market this year. If you think about interconnection, I think this really provides a good example of what can happen, how to at least think about interacting in the future. And so if you look at all the money that was injected into this system, we've essentially created a relatively rapidly maturing market here for alternative proteins. And so companies are looking for how to engage there, and at the highest level, we have what's now emerged as, well, we need to find our niche opportunities. Where are our regional opportunities to get in this space, get a piece of that pie, and move forward with that, and that's happening. And so that's very high level. But if you look down below that and really think about how you can engage in a more interconnected way, well, a lot of these alternative protein sources have other avenues and other areas to move into the system. For instance, we've done a lot of work on alternative feed sources. So if you're thinking about protein sources, right, where else can your protein source fit in? You can also think about, as you move on down the line, what does it mean to be a food company? One thing we did this year was write a report, Food Company 2050, and we're seeing that trait developers, or companies that were, let's say, once trait developers, we have Benson Hill Biosystems, Calyx, these types of companies are now saying, well, we produce something that is very, very high in protein content, maybe 40% increase or something like that in what it was in the past. Can you retain the value of that? And what we're seeing for those companies is, well, they're tracking that particular product all the way through the food chain to where it's being utilized. And so in doing that, they actually ensure that they're maintaining the quality. And so that's I think a really big linkage where we're now in an agriculture company that's traditionally is considering itself a food company. And so to me, that really suggests that interconnectedness, and it opens up opportunities too.
Thanks a lot, Josh. We will have you back shortly for the Q&A portion. And with that, I'd like to have our final panelist join, my colleague Chris Robinson, who leads our mobility program, also works at the intersection of mobility and energy. And Chris, in that kind of nexus of transportation, mobility, and the energy sector at large, what did you see? What were we asked most about in 2020? What really popped in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the intersection of energy and mobility, it's a lot about powertrains, of course. How do you move things from point A to point B? And we've always gotten a lot of questions on that, but especially with the challenges that automakers had in 2020 with the drop in demand, some production issues, clients were really interested about, what does this mean for the future of electric vehicles, the future of fuel cell vehicles? In the case of electrification, I think, reflecting on 2020, it's pretty clear that we've accelerated a transition toward battery electric vehicles. Governments that are offering some industry support to the automotive sector, they're tying that to, incentives or tax credits for buying battery electric vehicles. We've seen investments on the automaker side continue to increase as well. A big theme has been dedicated battery electric vehicle platforms, which GM, most recently Hyundai last week announced, their platforms and kind of showed them to the world. Toyota is expected to, debut a small SUV based on their dedicated platform. And even someone like BMW, a smaller automaker had focused on, kind of a variable powertrain strategy, is now saying, actually, we need a dedicated platform. And then also on the infrastructure side, we're seeing more infrastructure continue to be added and led by automakers. So looking at, the Ionity network in Europe really kind of funded by automakers themselves. The conversation around hydrogen is a little bit different with fuel cells. If we're thinking about passenger vehicles, really, we saw a lot of activity shifting interest away from that sector and toward things like heavy duty applications, thinking about, Class 8 long haul trucking, Daimler, Volvo, Toyota, they've all been shifting their focus on those applications. And ultimately makes a lot of sense. With a fuel cell powertrain, storing energy is fairly cheap and it's lightweight, right? It's maybe $10 a kilowatt hour to store energy in a carbon fiber tank. But of course, with batteries, it's the opposite case. So, applications where you need a lot of energy and you have a lot of range is where you see a good fit for hydrogen.
And just wrapping up from all of those things that you've observed, what's your biggest takeaway from 2020, and how does that inform where you think things are headed in 2021?
Yeah, I think for 2020, really thinking about COVID as a stress test for industries and companies was a pretty interesting way to kind of reflect back on the year. Really understanding how resilient is an industry or company to dramatic changes. And we've seen some pretty drastically different responses. Oil and gas companies, they've largely failed that stress test. While the big headlines of things like negative $40 per barrel, that's probably an anomaly, but it is kind of a symptom of a bigger underlying issue, which is, although in theory there's a diversified product mix, they're still too reliant on demand from transportation to really survive mass electrification and a decrease in demand from the transportation sector. And, kind of reflecting if there was something they could have done to better prepare for this, it really would have been looking at something like biofuels. For the oil and gas industry, they've mostly viewed biofuels with disdain, right? I mean, they're not investing in making it themselves. If they have a kind of biofuel mix mandate to meet, they're usually buying it from, someone else and mixing it with their own fuels. But, if they had invested in production themselves, more than even the minimum that was mandated, they could have been in a much better position to absorb some of that, 15% or so decrease in demand by just kind of stopping the biofuels production, relying mostly on oil, except from what you are mandated to provide in that, and do a better job of managing supply to keep prices stable. On the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, an industry that really passed the stress test that surprised me, to be honest, was ride-hailing companies. If you think about flexibility and being nimble, I think ride-hailing companies really embodied the perfect COVID response. While they had already been diversifying outside of just ride-hailing, they really kind of jumped right into focusing on things like food delivery, in some cases parcel or pharmaceuticals delivery. If we look at Asia, especially Southeast Asia, there's a big focus on fintech, which has really been a benefit in kind of weathering this pandemic. And it's not just about adapting to change and finding new sources of revenue. These companies really haven't had a setback in their long-term vision. Someone like Uber, we've been saying for a couple of years now, they really have to work with public transportation to be that kind of one-stop shop for mobility in a city. And they're still executing on that vision, acquiring someone like Routematch, which is, really a route optimization for public transport. They also had their first software as a service sale in the public transportation sector. So, for me, when I think back to 2020, it really was the year that these ride-hailing companies that have been trying to say, hey, we're a mobility company, it's really the first year they've actually executed on that vision.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot for joining. We will have you back very shortly for the Q&A portion. We'll bring all the panelists back. But before that, I want to do a quick wrap up, just in terms of how you can think about this exercise and do it productively yourself in some cases. The first thing is, we can't ignore COVID-19. I don't think we can expect it to suddenly just everything goes back as normal necessarily, even though the vaccine and other things will enable that. I think we should be confident that we'll move past COVID-19. But as Chris just alluded to with the idea that COVID-19 is more of a stress test, we have to learn from it, because it did uncover weaknesses, whether it's the food supply chain, whether it's the response of oil and gas. It taught us a lot about the weaknesses in our respective industries. So we really need to learn from that and shore up those strengths going forward. So it's really a time to reflect on the impact that COVID-19 really had on your business and your industry. The other recommendation is to be methodical about capturing trends. We have a platform so we can actually pull data out of it. You probably have a lot of data about the activities within your projects and the progress behind them, but also things around you like news events or peer developments. Be methodical in how you capture those trends. Look at your different data sources, do your best to unify them, and try and extract the important trends that come out of that. And the last thing is, as you process all this data, and you should be pointed about taking a step back and doing that, is challenge your initiatives. Challenge your beliefs that that organizations tend to hold, where they believe certain things about an industry, certain things about a technology. We often hear that something that got killed 5-10 years ago now makes sense. So you need to think about things that are in the past. You have to think about what you're doing now. Challenge yourselves aggressively, ask those questions. And there's really no better time to do that than at the end of the year. So with that, I really appreciate everybody joining. We will be doing a Q&A now. So the way Q&A works is you can enter questions in the questions box. If we don't get your question, we'll be in touch after the webinar. But with that, I'm going to bring back all my colleagues. If you guys can pop back on. Great. And thank you all again for joining. And as questions come in, I'm going to take a chance to ask one of my own. And it's about this kind of inescapable rise or resurgence of sustainability. And I think that touches all of the groups that you guys represent here today. So I'm wondering if you can even play off each other when you talk about how you relate sustainability opportunities back to your focus area, but also how you see it, if any of you see connections between what you all are doing. So whether it's mobility, materials, agri-food, I'm interested in a perspective on a more unified sustainability approach rather than just looking in silos. So you could start with your particular area, but I'm also interested in your thoughts on how to bring these things together. So maybe I'll throw it to Anthony to start.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably the most unifying thing is the need for sustainability transparency. This is something that Josh has talked about in the agri-food space. It's certainly something that comes up a lot in the issue of plastic waste. You've got companies developing, waste tracking markers and software platforms and trialing a lot of different things. And even in kind of the more baseline, like electronics industry and automotive industry, just doing supplier, surveys, doing auditing, making sure that, materials are being used responsibly and disposed of correctly. That type of sustainability is really crucial because you need it to make any kind of decision. You really can't improve your sustainability if you don't know what it is. And so there's a need for shared platforms, I think, and digital tools that can really make that data accessible, while also kind of ensuring that there's a level of privacy, or that there's a level of, you don't want to be completely transparent about how your business operates, because that might give away competitive secrets. So there's a lot of things to balance, but I think that's that need for transparency is really universal.
You know, Anthony, I would add something to that. I think, so I work a lot in the agri-food area, but specifically in agriculture. And you brought up some points that I think are really important there. And one that I think is important is, how do you make money while being sustainable? And, as much as it's, wonderful to produce things sustainably and to do that, right? In the end, you do produce a higher value product, and how many markets is that able to actually penetrate and get into? And I think what we're seeing is an interesting momentum happening in agri-food, which combines everything you were bringing up on traceability, transparency, challenges in data privacy. So if you're a grower and you want to improve how you're producing things, lower your impact, and perhaps even, let's say, leave the soil better it was than when you got there that year, how do you achieve that? And can you actually work with companies to demonstrate that and then get paid for it? And we're seeing some momentum there, right? Many probably have heard of the soil carbon sequestration and how we're seeing the potential for a market to develop there. And we've seen some of the first credits actually purchased. Shopify purchased some of the first credits on the Carbon Now network, which is a pilot between Locus Ag Solutions and Nori. And we're seeing, other companies be very interested there. We see Bayer, we see Land O'Lakes, and others are really pushing forward in this. Now, it's still unclear how successful it's going to be, but I think, the fact that, those who are able to take on, let's say, more sustainable practices and then link those in a very transparent, traceable way, right? To sequester these credits, you have to have the evidence, the transparency to support that. And I think it's a good example that supports what you were getting at, all of these components necessary to have that outcome actually achieved, and then to actually make some new revenue off of that stream. Yeah.
And there's a question here that I'm synthesizing about kind of commonalities across all the different areas you guys talked about. And I might start with Katrina on this one, because in particular it calls out the use of AI as an example of something that's kind of universally linked across all these things we talked about. And the question is, and I have opinions on this, but I want to hear what you have to say, Katrina, which is there evidence that organizations are getting smarter about using AI generally and not overestimating its capabilities, but thinking about its utility and actually getting results out of it? What is your perspective from what you've seen?
I'd say some organizations. So I do think that we're getting some of the right questions there, and we are seeing some clients that and companies in general that are making their AI choices, are discovering that maybe AI isn't quite the right or quite the tool that they thought it was initially, discovering some of the difficulties of AI and sort of creating more realistic perspectives about AI and what AI can do. I wouldn't say that that's universal and across the board. I think that there are a lot of a lot of folks out there that are still trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do with this tool. But it's absolutely the case that AI is not a magic solution for everything. And frankly, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot and working with a lot of clients on is that AI projects are quite a bit more complex to manage than a conventional software project. This is not quite so straightforward, and it requires a lot of ongoing maintenance and ongoing management. So I think we are starting to see some folks that are making the right steps here, but it's certainly not universal. I think there's still a lot to learn when it comes to AI.
Yeah, and I'm going to break the rules and answer the question, even though I'm asking them. Is also, we work with a lot of clients. You continue to see people who just want to use AI because it's AI. That's not necessarily everyone. I think there are certainly more sophisticated approaches, but there does seem to be there remains this kind of raw interest in AI for the sake of AI, and I think it's important to move past that. So we do see companies starting to understand the value proposition, but it really starts with people from the top, the CEO on down, understanding what the problem they want to solve is and if AI is the best solution. And that's typically not always the approach we see. So that's something I've observed in working with clients across the AI space. Anthony, I just want to extend that question to you, because you work in an area where there's also a lot of interest in materials informatics, which is bringing AI to an industry that's not necessarily an expert in it. How have you seen that happen, the integration of a new tool that may be a little bit more outside their wheelhouse?
Yeah, I won't say too much, but I think that there's a lot of hesitancy because people think AI is going to kind of replace R&D, replace science. Where in reality, I think a lot of times the process of learning about AI is actually enhancing people's understanding of the real world, of the physical product that they're sort of minding. I know there's a lot of interest in energy and the mobility sector. Chris, I don't know if you had a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from the mobility perspective, I think when I think about autonomous vehicle development, I think there's a lot of parallels with what Katrina and Kevin mentioned, right? It's no longer like, oh, we're just going to deploy autonomous vehicles. They're really useful. They're going to solve, make transportation cheaper and all that. It's really about unique, specific use cases, right? So, food delivery, public disinfecting of public spaces were big kind of use cases. But, also from a tech development side, we saw more discussions around functional safeties. Like, how do you build an autonomous vehicle that meets your ISO 26262 standards? More considerations around things like cybersecurity in the vehicle. So some of those more practical considerations are definitely popular topics this year.
Great, thank you all. It's clear we could always use more time to have these conversations, and maybe that's something we'll build into future presentations or future forums with our clients. Thank you all for joining today, both on the attendee side as well as our presenters. The slide presentation recording will be sent to all attendees in the next 48 hours. After the webinar, you will get a prompt to complete a survey. We do look at these. We do use it to inform how we organize and how we present these. So please do fill that out and give us feedback. We really appreciate it. And with that, thanks again to everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.